August 13th, 1940. Eagle Day. The morning sky over the English Channel filled with the drone of 1,500 German aircraft, the largest aerial armada ever assembled. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would destroy the Royal Air Force in 4 days. 4 weeks at most. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Germany had 2,800 operational aircraft against Britain's 650 fighters. 3-to-1 odds. The Spitfires and Hurricanes, no matter how brave their pilots, would be overwhelmed, annihilated, swept from the skies. What Göring didn't know, what none of the German commanders could have imagined, was that the battle was already lost. Not because of British courage, though that would prove extraordinary. Not because of the Spitfire or Hurricane, though both were formidable machines. The battle was lost because of something the Germans couldn't see, couldn't touch, and barely understood. 21 concrete towers stood along Britain's coastline, each rising 350 feet into the air. Their steel antenna arrays pointed toward France, like giant metal nets stretched across the sky. Inside cramped rooms at their bases, young women, most barely out of school, recruited just months earlier, sat before glowing cathode ray tubes, watching green dots crawl across circular screens. These were not the glamorous fighter pilots who would later be celebrated as the few. These were the invisible warriors, the women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, whose vigilance would prove just as crucial as any aerial dogfight. At RAF Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory, 40 miles northwest of London, the radar plots were being transformed into coloured markers on a massive map table the size of a small room. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding stood on a balcony above, watching as Women's Auxiliary Air Force plotters moved wooden blocks across the gridded surface with long rakes, each block representing a formation of aircraft. He could see the entire German formation while it was still assembling over France, 80 miles away, a full 20 minutes before they would cross the English coast. The information was precise enough. Bearing 135 degrees, range 65 miles, altitude approximately 15,000 feet, estimated strength 70-plus aircraft. That was all Dowding needed. Scramble 11 Group, he ordered calmly. Across southern England, telephone bells rang in dispersal huts. Pilots sprinted from card games and newspapers. Merlin engines coughed to life with that distinctive bark that would become the sound of British defiance. Within 4 minutes, Hurricanes and Spitfires were rolling toward takeoff positions. Within 8 minutes, they were airborne and climbing. By the time the German bombers crossed the English coast at 8:15, 50 British fighters were already at 20,000 feet, perfectly positioned 5 miles ahead of the approaching bombers, with the sun behind them, the classic attack position. The German crews, expecting to achieve total surprise, instead flew into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. The lead bomber's gunner, spotting the diving Spitfires, screamed into the intercom, "Achtung!" Fighters! How did they know we were coming? That question would haunt the Luftwaffe for the next 4 months. And the answer, invisible radio waves bouncing off aircraft and returning to receiver stations, would change warfare forever. In 1935, the British Air Ministry faced an existential crisis that kept senior officers awake at night. Aviation technology had advanced faster than anyone had predicted. Modern bombers, the German Heinkel He-111, the British Bristol Blenheim, could fly at 250 meters at 20,000 feet. They could cross the English Channel in less than 15 minutes. By the time ground observers spotted them and telephoned warnings to airfields, by the time pilots could scramble and climb to altitude, the bombers would have already dropped their loads and departed. The problem was mathematical and seemingly unsolvable. Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, then commanding RAF Research and Development, performed the calculations repeatedly, hoping for a different answer. He never got one. Even if every fighter in Britain was airborne 24 hours a day, an obvious impossibility, they couldn't possibly intercept more than 10% of incoming raids. The remaining 90% would get through to their targets. London would burn. Manchester would burn. Britain would fall. In 1934, the RAF conducted a series of large-scale exercises to test their defensive capabilities. About 350 aircraft participated, half playing bombers attempting to reach London, half playing fighters trying to stop them. The results were catastrophic. Even when fighter controllers were given complete details of the bombers' locations prior to the mission, an unrealistic advantage. 70% of the bombers reached London without having even seen a fighter. As one RAF commander grimly summarized, "A feeling of defenselessness and dismay has seized the public." The Treasury, faced with this terrifying reality, allocated $10,000, approximately $50,000 in 1935 currency, for research into any technology that might solve the bomber problem. It was a pittance, barely enough to fund a month of serious research. Most military experts considered it money wasted. The problem, they believed, was simply unsolvable. Physics itself seemed to favor the attacker. Britain appeared to be living on borrowed time, waiting for the inevitable war that would destroy it from the air. On February 12, 1935, a memorandum landed on the desk of Robert Watson Watt, superintendent of the radio research station at Ditton Park, near Slough. Watson Watt, a Scottish physicist with a background in radio wave research, had been studying atmospheric radio phenomena, lightning in particular, for years. The request, forwarded by H.E. Wimperis, Director of Scientific Research at the Air Ministry, asked a seemingly absurd question that had been circulating in newspapers and military circles for years. Could radio waves be used to create a death ray that would destroy aircraft in flight or kill their crews? The concept wasn't pure fantasy. Newspaper stories and scientific journals had speculated about electromagnetic weapons for decades. Inventors periodically claimed to have developed such devices. The Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense, known informally as the Tizard Committee, after its chairman, physicist Henry Tizard, was formed specifically to investigate these claims and determine if any had merit. Watson Watt was skeptical, but he was also methodical. He assigned his assistant, Arnold Skip Wilkins, to perform calculations on the power requirements. Wilkins, a Cambridge-trained physicist, worked through the numbers using established physics principles. The mathematics were unforgiving. To kill a pilot through radio waves would require heating their body tissue to lethal temperatures, essentially cooking them alive from a distance. The calculations showed this would require approximately 100 kilowatts of continuous power, focused precisely on a single aircraft at operational ranges of several miles. Britain's most powerful radio transmitter, the BBC station at Daventry, produced barely 10 kilowatts, and even that couldn't be focused narrowly enough to be effective at such ranges. It's impossible, Wilkins concluded, handing his calculations to Watson Watt. The power requirements are absurd. We'd need technology decades ahead of what exists. Watson Watt stared at the calculations for a long moment. Then, being a practical scientist rather than a disappointed dreamer, he asked a different question. If we can't generate enough power to kill them, could we generate enough to detect them? The question changed everything. Wilkins bent over his slide rule again. This time, the math was much more encouraging. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. If you broadcast a pulse of radio energy, and it bounces off a metal aircraft, the echo would return in a fraction of a second. Measure the time delay and you could calculate the distance. The power requirements were minimal. Any standard transmitter could do it. The challenge wasn't generating enough power to destroy. It was building receivers sensitive enough to detect the incredibly weak echoes returning from distant aircraft. Theoretically, yes, Wilkins said slowly, his excitement building as he checked his calculations. If an aircraft reflects enough radio energy, and if our receivers are sensitive enough to detect it, yes, this should work. Watson Watt immediately wrote a memorandum to the Air Ministry. Titled Detection and Location of Aircraft by Radio Methods, it was dated February 12, 1935, and would prove to be one of the most important documents in military history. The death ray was impossible, Watson Watt explained, but radio detection was feasible. With existing technology, they should be able to detect aircraft at ranges up to 100 miles, providing 20 minutes of warning time, enough for fighters to scramble and climb to interception altitude. The Air Ministry's response was swift. They wanted a demonstration, immediately. 2 weeks later, on February 26, 1935, Watson, Watt and Wilkins stood in a frozen field near the village of Weedon, roughly 8 miles from the BBC's powerful shortwave transmitter at Daventry. The transmitter, broadcasting at 49 meters wavelength, was one of the most powerful in Britain, used for overseas broadcasts to the Empire. The equipment was crude, deliberately so. Watt wanted to prove the concept using only existing, off-the-shelf technology. No special apparatus, no secret inventions, just standard radio receivers and an oscilloscope to display the signals. The plan was simple. The BBC transmitter would provide the radio source, a continuous broadcast that filled the air with radio energy. Wilkins had set up a receiving antenna tuned to the same frequency. A Royal Air Force Handley Page, Hayford bomber, a lumbering biplane bomber already obsolete but conveniently available, would fly a precise course between the transmitter and receiver. At 11:30 a.m., the Hayford took off and began its run. Wilkins watched his oscilloscope screen intently. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. The screen showed only the steady pulse from the BBC transmitter, a spike representing the direct signal traveling from Daventry to their receiver. Then, at 11:42 a.m., a second spike appeared on the screen. It was tiny, barely a centimeter tall, flickering and unstable, but it was unmistakable. When the bomber flew through the radio beam, radio waves bounced off its metal skin and returned to the receiver. The oscilloscope was showing them an echo, a ghost of the aircraft visible on a glowing green screen. Hugh Dowding, who had travelled from London to witness the demonstration, leaned over Wilkins' shoulder and watched as the spike appeared and disappeared with each pass of the bomber. "How far away is it?" Dowding asked. "About 8 miles, sir," Wilkins replied, checking his calculations. "And you believe you can extend this range?" "To at least 60 miles, sir. Possibly more with better equipment." Dowding watched the flickering green spike for another minute. Then he straightened up and turned to Watt. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I believe you've just saved England." He immediately authorized additional funding. Within days, Watt received 12,300, still a laughably small sum by military standards, but enough to continue development. The race to build Britain's radar shield had begun. The progress over the next 4 years was remarkable, driven by the growing certainty that war was inevitable. By July 1935, just 5 months after the Daventry demonstration, Watt's team had built a dedicated experimental radar system at Orfordness on the Suffolk coast. This system could detect bomber-sized targets at ranges of 60 miles, precisely as predicted. By the end of 1935, the British Treasury approved a plan to construct 5 radar stations around London as an experimental early warning system. The technology was still unproven, still experimental. But the need was desperate enough to justify the risk. In August 1936, Watt was named superintendent of the newly established Bawdsey Research Station, a manor house on the Suffolk coast that became Britain's radar research centre. The entire facility was dedicated to one purpose: turning Watt's crude experimental system into an operational air defence network. The technical challenges were enormous. The early systems were wildly unreliable. On one occasion, Dowding himself was watching the displays of the test system, waiting for any sign of approaching aircraft, when he heard them pass directly overhead, a complete failure of the system to detect aircraft that were literally above the station. Such failures were terrifying reminders that the technology was far from perfected. But Watt and his team persisted, solving problems one by one. They discovered that aircraft altitude could be measured by comparing signal strength between receivers at different heights, not precise but accurate to within 2,000 feet, which was sufficient. They developed better transmitters, more sensitive receivers, and improved display systems. By April 1937, tests using the prototype chain-home radar at Bawdsey demonstrated genuine promise. The system could reliably detect aircraft formations at ranges exceeding 80 miles, sometimes reaching 100 miles, under ideal atmospheric conditions. Controllers could track multiple formations simultaneously and update their positions every few minutes. The decision was made. Britain would build a complete chain of radar stations along its vulnerable eastern and southern coasts. The stations were positioned approximately 25 miles apart, their overlapping coverage creating a continuous detection zone stretching from the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland down to the Isle of Wight. On the southern coast, These first three chain home stations began 24-hour duty. In 1938, by 1939, there were 20 operational stations. By the outbreak of war in September 1939, the network was substantially complete, a wall of invisible eyes watching the approaches to Britain. Each chain home station followed a standardized design that became instantly recognizable. 4 massive steel transmitter towers rose 350 feet into the air, taller than the Statue of Liberty, supporting curtain antennas made of copper wire arranged in geometric patterns. Nearby, 4 wooden receiver towers, 240 feet tall, supported crossed dipole antennas. The transmitters produced 350 kilowatts of peak power, broadcasting pulses at wavelengths between 10 and 13 meters. The pulses lasted only 2 microseconds, but were repeated 25 times per second, creating a continuous surveillance of the airspace ahead. At the base of each station, inside cramped concrete buildings, operators watched cathode ray tubes that displayed the returning echoes as bright spots on glowing green screens. The technology was crude by later standards. Directional accuracy was poor. Altitude measurements were estimates. The displays were difficult to interpret, but it worked. And it worked consistently enough to be operationally useful. The Germans photographed these towers extensively. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft flying along the Channel coast documented every station, measuring their positions, studying their construction. German intelligence analysts examined the photographs and drew conclusions. The wavelengths are absurdly long, one technical report stated. 10 to 13 meters? At such wavelengths, directional accuracy would be essentially useless. Range measurement would be crude at best. These stations appear to be some sort of navigation aid or early warning system for maritime traffic. They are unlikely to be effective for aircraft detection. The assessment was both correct and catastrophically wrong. The wavelengths were indeed absurdly long. The directional accuracy was indeed poor. But poor was good enough. The RAF didn't need to know an aircraft's position to within a few feet. They needed to know it was coming, approximately where it was, and roughly how many there were. Chain home provided exactly that, and it provided it 20 minutes before the aircraft reached the coast. 20 minutes was everything. But radar alone wasn't enough. Watson Watt understood this from the beginning. Detecting aircraft was useless without a method to rapidly process that information and direct fighters to intercept. The challenge wasn't just technological, it was organizational. This was where Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding's genius became apparent. Appointed Commander-in-Chief of RAF Fighter Command on July 6, 1936, Dowding inherited a defensive system that was essentially medieval, ground observers with binoculars and telephones, trying to track aircraft that moved at 200 mph at 20,000 feet. It was hopeless. Dowding, working with the Tizard Committee and mathematician Patrick Blackett, designed something unprecedented. An integrated air defense system that combined radar detection, ground observers, fighter aircraft, and anti-aircraft. Guns into a unified network with centralized command and control. The system that emerged became known as the Dowding System, though Dowding himself never called it that. To him, it was simply the system, but it was the most sophisticated military command and control network ever created up to that point in history. The system was hierarchical, with information flowing rapidly through carefully designed channels. Chain home stations formed the outer ring. Young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, recruited by the thousands starting in 1939, sat before cathode ray tubes in shifts around the clock. They watched for the telltale spikes that indicated aircraft, measured their positions using graduated scales on the screens, and reported these positions via telephone. Filter rooms at Fighter Command headquarters received all these reports. Telephone operators, more WAAF personnel, took calls from radar stations and relayed information to plotters standing around a massive map table. The plotters used colored markers to indicate aircraft positions. Since each radar station had unique inaccuracies, multiple stations reporting the same formation would place markers in slightly different locations. Experienced observers watched the pattern of markers, identified which ones represented single formations, and placed wooden blocks on the map to represent each distinct group of aircraft. These blocks were given track numbers, simple 2-digit identifiers. From that point forward, the entire system referred to formations by their track numbers. Track 25 might be a formation of bombers heading toward London. Track 33 might be friendly fighters returning to base. The filter room's job was to reduce the clutter of individual radar plots into manageable tracks that could be followed and directed. Group operations rooms received filtered information from Fighter Command headquarters. Fighter Command was divided into 4 active groups during the Battle of Britain: 10 Group, 11 Group, 12 Group, and 13 Group, each responsible for a geographic sector. Each group had its own operations room with its own map table, recreating the portions of the master map relevant to their area. Group, commanded by Air Vice Marshal Keith Park from its headquarters at RAF Uxbridge, handled most of the fighting over southeastern England. Park's operations room, preserved today as the Battle of Britain bunker, contained a map covering Kent, Sussex, and the approaches to London. Plotters recreated tracks from information passed down from Fighter Command headquarters using wooden blocks with tags indicating track numbers, altitude, estimated aircraft numbers, and whether the formation was hostile or friendly. Sector operations rooms formed the lowest level of the hierarchy. Each group was divided into sectors, which controlled one or more airfields. For example, 11 Group's Sector C, controlled from RAF Biggin Hill, was responsible for fighters operating from Biggin Hill and RAF West Malling. The sector operations room had its own map table, showing just their immediate area of operations. It was the sector controllers who actually communicated with pilots in the air. They were the voice on the radio giving vectors, altitudes, and target information. To ensure pilots would follow orders, fighter pilots tended to be independent-minded individuals who disliked taking instructions from paper pushers. Sector controllers were typically former pilots themselves, either retired or on medical leave. They spoke the language of aerial combat and understood what they were asking of the men in the air. The genius of the system was in the filtering of information at each level. Fighter Command headquarters might be tracking 50 different formations across all of Britain, but 11 Group would only receive information about the 15 formations relevant to their sector, and Sector C at Biggin Hill would only receive information about the 3 or 4 formations actually approaching their area. The pilots themselves only heard about the one formation they were being directed to intercept. This prevented information overload. Pilots didn't need to know about raids attacking Scotland or Wales. They needed to know about the enemy formation 10 miles ahead and 2,000 feet above them. The sector controller provided exactly that information and nothing more. The entire system was tied together by hundreds of miles of dedicated telephone lines, buried deep underground to prevent them from being cut by bombs. The post office laid these lines in a massive infrastructure project, creating a communications network that could function even under heavy attack. The speed of information flow was extraordinary. From radar detection to fighter scramble, 90 seconds average. From scramble to airborne, 3 to 4 minutes. Total time from detection to interception, typically 15 to 20 minutes. Winston Churchill, visiting Fighter Command headquarters during the battle, watched the system in operation and later wrote, "All the ascendancy of the Hurricanes and Spitfires would have been fruitless but for this system which had been devised and built before the war. It had been shaped and refined in constant action, and all was now fused together into a most elaborate instrument of war, the like of which existed nowhere in the world." The Dowding System depended absolutely on the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. During the Battle of Britain, over 17,000 WAAF served with the RAF, nearly 4,500 of them with Fighter Command specifically. They worked as radar operators, plotters, telephone operators, radio operators, and clerks, the entire information processing infrastructure of the system. These women received minimal training, often just 6 weeks, before being placed in front of complex equipment and told to watch for enemies. Many had never seen an aircraft before joining the WAAF. Most came from ordinary backgrounds, shopgirls, clerks, students, but they learned quickly because they had to. Lives depended on their accuracy and speed. WAAF radar operator Denise Miley, stationed at RAF Bawdsey, spent 12-hour shifts watching cathode ray tubes, moving a cursor to the position of each echo and calling out grid coordinates to plotters. The work was exhausting, requiring constant concentration. Missing a single formation could mean death for British civilians or fighter pilots caught by surprise. We became incredibly good at reading those screens, one operator later recalled. Each aircraft had a signature, a personality. You learned to recognize them like faces. That large, steady blip, heavy bombers, probably Heinkels. Those scattered, dancing returns, fighters, Me-109s most likely. We couldn't see them with our eyes, but we could see them on our screens, clear as day. The danger was real. At RAF Biggin Hill, one of the busiest sector stations, WAAF personnel remained at their posts during bombing attacks. On August 31, 1940, 8 Dornier bombers carrying 1,000-pound bombs evaded Observer Corps detection by flying at extremely low altitude and attacked the station directly. The operations room took a direct hit. The concrete roof collapsed and the plotting table was smashed. Several WAAF personnel were injured, but they continued working from an emergency operations room within hours. 3 WAAF members at Biggin Hill, Flight Officer Elspeth Henderson, Sergeant Joan Mortimer, and Sergeant Helen Turner, were awarded the Military Medal for remaining at their posts during air raids. 6 WAAF personnel received the Military Medal during the Battle of Britain, recognition of courage under fire equal to any combat pilot, yet their work remained classified for decades. The Official Secrets Act prohibited them from discussing what they did during the war. Many died without their families knowing the crucial role they played. Mary Wayne, whose mother worked at RAF Bordsey as a radar operator, said in a 2023 interview, "Obviously she was told that you couldn't talk about what you did, and I'd say she did literally take that to her grave. I never knew what she did until years after she died." The women of the WAAF understood what was at stake. When radar operator Avis Parsons was interviewed in the 1990s, decades after the war, she described those months with matter-of-fact modesty. "We were just doing our jobs. Watching screens, plotting returns, calling out numbers. We didn't think of it as winning the war. We thought of it as helping our boys find the Germans. If we did that well, they had a chance. If we failed, they died. So we didn't fail." Through June and early July 1940, the radar chain and the Dowding system were tested in small-scale engagements as German aircraft probed British defences. The system performed well, but these were just skirmishes. The real test came in August. On August 13, 1940, Adlertag Eagle Day, Germany launched Operation Eagle Attack. Göring had assembled the largest air force ever committed to battle, 2,800 operational aircraft, including 1,200 bombers and 1,600 fighters. The plan was simple and brutal: overwhelm the RAF through sheer numbers, destroy their fighters in the air and on the ground, then bomb Britain into submission. The Luftwaffe expected to achieve tactical surprise on most raids. Their intelligence indicated the RAF had approximately 300 serviceable fighters scattered across southeastern England. German commanders calculated that with proper coordination, they could concentrate overwhelming force at specific points, destroying British fighters before they could assemble in effective numbers. What happened instead shocked every German commander. Every major raid was intercepted. Not 30% or 50%, the rates considered excellent in previous conflicts. Nearly every single raid encountered British fighters, often perfectly positioned with altitude and sun advantage, attacking before the Germans reached their targets. On August 15th, the Luftwaffe's maximum effort, they launched 2,119 sorties across multiple raids. The RAF flew 974 defensive sorties. German losses, 75 aircraft. British losses, 34 fighters, with most pilots surviving thanks to parachutes and fighting over home territory. The mathematics were working backward. The Luftwaffe was losing more than 2 aircraft for every British fighter destroyed, despite having overwhelming numerical superiority. At these rates of attrition, Germany would run out of aircraft and pilots long before Britain did. German bomber crews reported impossible British response times. Fighters appeared minutes after crossing the coast, positioned as if they had been waiting for hours. The RAF seemed to have perfect intelligence on every raid. Squadron leader Peter Townsend, commanding 85 Squadron during the battle, later explained what the German pilots couldn't understand. "We knew they were coming. We always knew. We'd get the scramble order, and by the time we were at altitude, The controller would be giving us vectors. Bandits at 20,000 feet. 30 miles southeast of Dover, approaching on heading 290. We'd turn, climb, and there they were, exactly where he said. It was like fighting with God's own intelligence service. We couldn't lose. The Germans were baffled. Luftwaffe intelligence intensified efforts to understand British capabilities. They knew about the tall towers along the coast. They had photographed them extensively. But they couldn't intercept any data transmissions from the towers. How were they communicating with the fighter bases? The answer, which German intelligence never fully grasped, was simple. They weren't transmitting data. All communication used landline telephones buried underground. The radar stations only transmitted their pulses, powerful but containing no intelligence information. Everything else flowed through wires that German electronic warfare specialists couldn't intercept. On August 12, 1940, German intelligence made a crucial observation. They noticed that when radar stations were attacked, British fighter response times increased dramatically in the affected sectors. The correlation was unmistakable and significant. That day, the Luftwaffe launched coordinated attacks against several chain home stations. Ventnor Station on the Isle of Wight took the worst damage. A carefully executed dive-bombing attack by Junkers Ju-87 Stukas knocked out the transmitter building and destroyed the receivers. The station went completely off the air. Immediately, a gap opened in Britain's radar coverage over the central English Channel and Hampshire coast. German bombers penetrating through the Ventnor sector on subsequent days encountered no fighter opposition until well inland, after ground observers spotted them. The critical 20-minute warning advantage disappeared. Response times reverted to the inadequate 7 to 10-minute warnings that made effective interception nearly impossible. German commanders noticed this immediately. Reports from bomber crews flying through the Ventnor sector documented the change. Fewer fighters, later interceptions, more successful bomb runs. The conclusion was obvious. Then, on August 15th, at a conference of Luftwaffe commanders held at Göring's palatial estate Karinhall north of Berlin, everything changed. According to RAF Museum official records, Göring reviewed the campaign's progress and made a fateful declaration. It is doubtful whether there is any point in continuing attacks on radar sites, in view of the fact that not one of those attacks so far has been put out of action. His assessment seemed reasonable based on reports he received. Ventnor Station had been reported as back online within days. Other attacked stations had continued operating or been quickly repaired. The tall towers themselves were difficult to destroy, essentially just steel frameworks that could be patched and restored relatively easily. What Göring didn't know, what his intelligence services failed to discover, was that Ventnor had not, in fact, been repaired quickly. The station remained completely offline for 11 days. British engineers couldn't repair the destroyed receivers and transmitter in the field. They required components that had to be manufactured and transported from research facilities. But the British were desperate to maintain the illusion that the system was undamaged. Engineers positioned mobile transmitters nearby and began broadcasting on Ventnor's frequency, creating fake signals that German listening stations could detect. To Luftwaffe electronic warfare monitors, Ventnor appeared operational. The deception was perfect. Meanwhile, adjacent chain home stations at Poling and Truly Hill extended their coverage as much as possible to partially fill the gap, though significant blind spots remained. The British knew they were living on borrowed time. If Germany had pressed systematic attacks on the radar chain during those 11 critical days, if they had realized the stations were far more vulnerable than they appeared, the entire early warning system might have collapsed. Fighter command would have been forced back to standing patrols and ground observer warnings, losing the decisive advantage that radar provided. But Göring, convinced the towers were nearly indestructible and contributed little to British defensive capabilities, ordered a change in strategy. The Luftwaffe would cease attacks on radar stations and focus entirely on what Göring considered more valuable targets: RAF airfields, aircraft factories and fighters in the air. The order went out on August 15th. No more attacks on radar stations. Focus on airfields. It was the decision that saved Britain. Historical analysts have called this one of the greatest strategic blunders of World War II. For 11 days, The British radar chain had a critical vulnerability. During those 11 days, systematic attacks could have opened permanent gaps in the coverage. Without radar, Fighter Command's effectiveness would have been reduced by more than half. The Battle of Britain might have had a very different outcome. Instead, Ventnor was quietly repaired. By August 23rd, the station was back online with newly installed equipment. The gap in coverage closed. The invisible shield was whole again, and the Germans never realized how close they had come to breaking it. The Luftwaffe's focus shifted to destroying RAF airfields, particularly the crucial sector stations that controlled fighter operations. If these could be knocked out, the radar chain would become useless. The information would have nowhere to go, no way to be translated into fighter interceptions. The attacks were devastating. On August 30th, 1940, RAF Biggin Hill was bombed for the second time in 2 weeks. On August 31st, the station suffered its worst attack of the entire war. 8 Dornier Do-17 bombers, flying at extremely low altitude to evade radar detection, swept over Biggin Hill at 1:00 p.m. They carried 1,000-pound bombs, and their aim was precise. The operations room took a direct hit. The concrete roof collapsed inward. The plotting table, the heart of Sector C's control system, was smashed to pieces. 2 hangars, the officers' mess, and several workshops were destroyed. Telephone lines were cut. Electrical systems failed. Water mains burst, flooding the crater-marked airfield. 39 people died on the ground that day, including several WAAF personnel. The sector station appeared to be completely knocked out of action, but the system Dowding had designed included redundancy. Within 2 hours, an emergency sector operations room was operational in a shop in nearby Caterham, using maps, telephones, and personnel who had been off duty during the attack. Communications were rerouted through backup lines. Within 4 hours, fighters from Biggin Hill were being controlled again, guided toward German formations by controllers working from a converted storefront. The speed of recovery shocked German intelligence, who had expected the attack to remove Biggin Hill from the battle for days or weeks. Instead, operations resumed almost immediately, albeit from improvised facilities. Between August 18th and January 7th, 1941, Biggin Hill was attacked 12 times. The station suffered extensive damage, lost dozens of personnel, and had facilities destroyed repeatedly. But it never stopped fighting. Sector C continued directing fighters throughout the battle, even when operating from damaged or improvised facilities. This resilience, the ability to absorb punishment and continue functioning, was built into the Dowding System's design. Redundant communications, emergency operations rooms, distributed command structures, and determined personnel meant that the system could survive even heavy attacks and continue operating effectively. The Luftwaffe was fighting an enemy more resilient than they had imagined. By early September, the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 1,000 aircraft. The RAF had lost 550 fighters, but was producing replacements faster than Germany. More critically, RAF pilot losses were sustainable barely, while Luftwaffe bomber crew losses were catastrophic. On September 7th, the Luftwaffe made another strategic shift. Instead of attacking RAF airfields, they would bomb London directly. The theory was that Britain would be forced to commit every available fighter to defend the capital, allowing the Luftwaffe to destroy Fighter Command in decisive battles over the city. Where German fighter escorts could provide better protection, the strategy failed catastrophically. British radar tracked every formation from the moment it assembled over France. The massive raids heading toward London were visible on plotting tables at Fighter Command headquarters 20 minutes before they crossed the coast. Controllers had ample time to position squadrons perfectly. September 15, 1940, became the climax of the battle, the day now celebrated as Battle of Britain Day. The Luftwaffe launched 2 massive daylight raids against London. The morning raid involved approximately 200 bombers, escorted by 700 fighters, one of the largest formations of the entire war. British radar detected them assembling over the Pas-de-Calais at 10:40 a.m., nearly 40 minutes before they crossed the English coast. Heavy raid building up, the filter room at Bentley Priory reported. Estimated 150 plus, possibly 200 plus aircraft. Every available squadron was scrambled. Fighters from 11 Group rose to meet the attack. When those squadrons engaged, 12 groups big wing formation, 3 squadrons flying together as a massed unit, attacked from a different angle. The German formations were hit repeatedly before reaching London, suffering severe losses. Prime Minister Winston Churchill chose that morning to visit 11 Groups operations room at RAF Uxbridge. He stood on the observation gallery above the plotting table, watching as WAAF plotters moved coloured markers across the map. Each marker represented squadrons of fighters, his fighters, rising to meet the German raids. Squadron after squadron was scrambled. The tote board showing squadron status changed from available to readiness to airborne to enemy sighted. Within 30 minutes, every single fighter squadron in 11 Group was engaged in combat. Churchill turned to Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group, and asked the question that would become famous. "What reserves do you have?" Park's reply was equally famous and utterly honest. "None, sir. Every squadron is engaged." For a moment, Churchill faced the terrifying reality that if the Germans launched a second wave immediately, there would be nothing left to stop them. Britain's fighter defences were completely committed. The fate of the nation hung on whether the squadrons already in the air could break up the raid, but engaged meant something different in September 1940 than it would have meant in 1914 or even in 1939. Engaged meant positioned, perfectly through radar guidance. Engaged meant hitting the Germans with altitude and sun advantage. Engaged meant attacking bombers exactly where radar had predicted they would be, at the altitude radar had estimated, with the numbers radar had counted. The morning raid was shattered. German formations broke apart under repeated attacks. Bombs fell haphazardly across London and surrounding areas, but the coordinated mass attack dissolved into chaos. The Luftwaffe lost 30 aircraft in the morning raid alone. The afternoon raid, involving approximately 150 aircraft, was detected by radar at 2:06 p.m. while still forming up over France. Again, every available squadron was scrambled. Again, British fighters were positioned perfectly through radar guidance. Again, the German formations were intercepted and mauled before reaching their targets. By nightfall, the Luftwaffe had lost 61 aircraft that day, the highest daily loss of the entire battle. The RAF lost 31 fighters, but most pilots survived, parachuting over friendly territory or crash landing at their home bases. 2 days later, on September 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely. Without air superiority, invasion was impossible, and air superiority, the Luftwaffe now understood, was impossible to achieve against an enemy who always knew they were coming. The numbers tell the story of why Britain won. Fighter Command flew approximately 40,000 sorties during the Battle of Britain. With radar and the Dowding System providing optimal positioning, British pilots achieved a kill ratio of approximately 1.5.1, despite being outnumbered 3.1. Historical analysis suggests that without radar, the equation would have been catastrophically different. Pre-radar interception rates were 30% to 50%, meaning over half of all fighter sorties returned without ever finding the enemy. With radar, interception rates during the Battle of Britain averaged 90%, with some raids achieving 100% interception rates. Statistical modeling indicates that without radar, Fighter Command would have needed to fly approximately 3 times as many sorties to achieve the same number of interceptions. The additional flight hours would have exhausted pilots faster, worn out aircraft quicker, and consumed fuel and ammunition that Britain didn't have. More significantly, without the positioning advantage that radar provided, the kill ratio would likely have inverted. British fighters, forced to search blindly for German formations, would have encountered enemy bombers at random altitudes and positions, often finding themselves below the bombers with enemy fighters above them. The worst possible tactical situation. Military analysts estimate that without radar, the kill ratio would have been approximately 1.3 in Germany's favour. 3 British fighters lost for every German aircraft destroyed. At such rates, Fighter Command would have been destroyed as an effective force within 4 to 6 weeks. The radar chain, that collection of crude, imprecise, technologically primitive stations operating at absurdly long wavelengths, provided the decisive advantage. Not through technological superiority. German radar development was actually ahead of Britain's in some respects, but through integration, organization, and operational doctrine. The Dowding System acted as what military analysts call a force multiplier. In numerical terms, it was as if Fighter Command had over twice as many fighters as it actually possessed. Against Germany's 2,800 aircraft, Britain's 650 fighters, multiplied by a factor of 2.5 through radar-guided efficiency, achieved effective parity. The Germans never fully understood what had defeated them until after the war. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from 1940 mentioned the radar towers occasionally, but consistently underestimated their importance. A July 16, 1940. Luftwaffe intelligence report failed to even mention the radar system, despite having complete photographic documentation of every station. A later report on August 7th did mention the system, but only to suggest that it would tie British fighters to their sectors, reducing their flexibility. Exactly wrong, as the system actually increased flexibility by allowing fighters to respond to threats anywhere within range. German pilots developed their own theories. Some believed the British had thousands of fighters constantly in the air. Others thought there was a network of spies providing intelligence. A few suspected the towers were involved somehow, but without understanding the complete system that turned radar plots into fighter interceptions. After the war, British historians interviewed surviving Luftwaffe commanders. Erhard Milch and Adolf Galland both admitted they knew one or two radar stations had been damaged during attacks, but neither realized how important the stations were to Fighter Command's interception technique or how vulnerable sustained attacks might have made the system. As the historians noted, neither seemed to realize how important were the RDF stations to a Fighter Command technique of interception or how embarrassing sustained attacks upon them would have been. This realization apparently sunk in over time. Galland later wrote with bitter hindsight, "From the first, the British had an extraordinary advantage, never to be balanced out at any time during the whole war, which was their radar and fighter control network and organization. It was for us a very bitter surprise. We had nothing like it. We could do no other than knock frontally against the outstandingly well-organized and resolute direct defense of the British Isles." General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commanding Luftflotte II during the battle, was even more explicit when interviewed by British intelligence in 1945. "You knew. You always knew. Where we were, how many, what altitude? Your fighters were always positioned perfectly. We thought it was espionage, perhaps, or radio intercepts. We never imagined it was those towers. Our intelligence assessed them as primitive, inaccurate, operationally insignificant. We were told the wavelengths made precision impossible. Perhaps they were technically primitive, but they were sufficient. You didn't need precision, you needed warning. And you had warning for every raid. If we had understood, if we had systematically destroyed your radar chain in August, during those days when Ventnor was actually offline, the outcome might have been different. But Göring convinced himself they weren't important. It was his greatest mistake. You didn't defeat us with courage, though your pilots were brave. You didn't defeat us with superior aircraft, though the Spitfire was excellent. You defeated us with information. You fought blind men with perfect vision. It was never a fair contest. The technology developed for chain-home evolved with remarkable speed. By 1941, British scientists developed the cavity magnetron, a device that could generate centimetric radar waves with wavelengths measured in centimeters rather than meters. These shorter wavelengths provided the precision that chain-home lacked. Compact centimetric radars fit into aircraft fuselages, enabling night fighters like the Bristol Beaufighter to hunt German bombers in darkness. They fit into ships, detecting submarines on the surface. Eventually, they fit into artillery shells, guiding projectiles to targets. The crude technology of 1940 spawned an entire revolution in electronic warfare. But the true innovation, the one that changed military operations permanently, wasn't technological. It was organizational. The Dowding System's concept of integrated air defense combining detection, command, control, and interception became the template for every modern military. The United States copied it, establishing their own integrated air defense. system and later developing the SAGE system that protected North America during the Cold War. The Soviet Union stole British radar secrets through espionage and developed their own integrated networks. Every modern air force operates some variant of the hierarchical, filtered command and control system that Dowding pioneered. Today's airborne warning and control system, AWACS aircraft, Aegis combat system ships, and ground-based air defense networks all descend directly from the principles Dowding established: early detection, centralized processing, filtered distribution of information, and directed response. Modern systems use computers, satellites, and data links instead of telephone lines and map tables, but the underlying concept remains unchanged. The chain home stations were decommissioned in the 1950s as more advanced radar systems replaced them. Most of the towers were demolished. The sites returned to civilian use or were absorbed into expanding military facilities, but a few fragments remain. At Bawdsey Manor, the original research station, the receiver building has been preserved as a museum. The cathode ray tubes are dark now, the equipment silent, but information placards explain the technology to visitors who struggle to imagine these primitive devices saving Britain. Outside, on the coastal cliffs facing toward France, a memorial plaque commemorates what happened there. From these stations, young men and women watched the skies with invisible eyes. They saw enemies before they arrived, giving warning to the defenders. They could not fight, but they ensured that others could fight wisely. In doing so, they helped win the Battle of Britain before a single shot was fired. The statement is accurate. The Battle of Britain was won not by Spitfires or Hurricanes, not by the courage of the few, but by the invisible shield of radio waves that gave British defenders the one advantage that mattered: knowledge. German pilots had joked about British fighters in June 1940. Where are they? They'd asked, bombing British cities with relative impunity. Are the British afraid to fight? By September 1940, they knew where the British fighters were. Everywhere, always. Positioned perfectly, attacking from optimal angles, vectored by invisible hands toward German formations with uncanny precision. The women who operated the chain home stations and staffed the filter rooms and operations rooms were forbidden from discussing their work for decades. The Official Secrets Act prohibited disclosure of anything related to radar or the command system. For most of the women, this meant they carried their wartime experiences in silence for their entire lives. Not until the 1970s, when radar technology became declassified and the official secrets restrictions were partially lifted, could they begin to tell their stories. By then, many were elderly or had already died. The crucial role they played had been largely forgotten by a public that remembered Spitfire pilots but knew nothing of the WAAF operators who guided them. Those who survived to tell their stories described those desperate summer months with characteristic British understatement. Avis Parsons, interviewed in 1995, "We were just doing our jobs, watching screens, plotting returns, calling out numbers. We didn't think of it as winning the war. We thought of it as helping our boys find the Germans. If we did that well, they had a chance. If we failed, they died. So we didn't fail." Gene Mills, another chain home operator. "People ask what it felt like to have such responsibility. We didn't think about it. We were 19, 20 years old. We'd been trained for 6 weeks, then put in front of these mysterious machines and told to watch for enemies. So we watched. Every shift, every day for months. Watching green dots crawl across screens. Those dots were aircraft carrying bombs to kill British civilians. Our job was to give our boys enough warning to stop them. We did our best. Apparently our best was good enough." Mary Wayne, whose mother served as a radar operator at Bawdsey, spoke in 2023 about the secrecy. "Obviously she was told that you couldn't talk about what you did, and I'd say she did literally take that to her grave. I never knew what she did until years after she died. When I finally learned about it, I wished I could have told her how proud I was. The invisibility of their contribution. Women watching invisible rays bouncing off invisible aircraft. Creating invisible advantages that won a visible war has a certain poetic irony. They were the invisible warriors who created Britain's invisible shield." Conclusion. The towers that saved Britain. 21 concrete towers and a chain of cathode ray tubes. That's what stood between Britain and defeat in 1940. Not the Spitfire, though it was a magnificent aircraft. Not the Hurricane, though it shot down more German aircraft than any other fighter. Not the courage of British pilots, though they displayed courage beyond measure. The towers gave Britain eyes to see the unseeable. The Dowding System gave Britain the means to translate that vision into action. The WAAF personnel gave Britain the human element that made the system work. And together, they created something unprecedented, an integrated air defense network that could detect, track, and intercept attacking aircraft with efficiency that seemed almost supernatural to the enemy. The weapon the Germans never understood, built on a budget of less than 1.5 million, smaller than the cost of a dozen bombers, defeated the most powerful air force on Earth. In June 1940, Germany had 2,800 operational aircraft. Britain had 650 fighters. The mathematics predicted annihilation. By October 1940, Germany had lost over 1,700 aircraft. Britain had lost 1,100 aircraft, but was producing replacements faster than they could be destroyed. More importantly, Britain had survived. The invasion had been postponed indefinitely. Hitler's attention was turning eastward, toward the Soviet Union. The invisible shield had held. Britain survived to become the launching point for the liberation of Europe. American forces would arrive by the hundreds of thousands, turning the island fortress into a massive military base. In 1944, from British airfields, the Allied invasion would launch across the Channel into France. None of it would have been possible if Britain had fallen in 1940. And Britain would have fallen without radar and the Dowding System, 21 towers. Some wooden blocks on map tables, telephone lines buried underground, young women watching glowing screens, an organizational structure that filtered information and directed fighters with unprecedented efficiency. That's what saved Western civilization. Not bad for a budget of less than £2 million and a technology the Germans dismissed as primitive and ineffective. The towers are gone now, demolished decades ago. But their legacy remains in every modern air defense system, in every integrated command network, in every military force that understands that information and organization matter as much as courage and firepower. And in a small museum at Bawdsey Manor, where it all began, visitors can still see the cathode ray tubes that once showed green dots crawling across glowing screens. Each dot an aircraft, each aircraft a threat, each threat detected 20 minutes before it arrived. 20 minutes was all Britain needed. The invisible shield provided it, and the world changed forever.